recording now. Okay, before I get half an hour in, and then we get to have done that. So, if I begin by outlining some of the ideas that Freud is talking about in the Uncanny, and then we can have a more open discussion afterwards. How? Oh, I got a message again. I'm not sure my mic isn't working. Okay, that's fine. Do you have any questions at any point? Do sort of put something up on the chat, or stick your hand up, and I'll be able to sort of pause and go over anything else. But get going, however, how did you find the essay? Were you familiar with it? I know some people might have read it before. Some might completely new to you. I don't know. How did you find the Uncanny? On that before we begin.
It's new to me.
Okay.
I found it actually easier to get my head round than I'd anticipated, if I'm being very honest.
Okay, that's good.
I thought some of it was really, really interesting, and I thought some of it I could relate to. The bits I felt were very interesting, I thought were very interesting. For example, and also the connections that we could make between some of the stuff that we've looked at in the previous week. So doubling, for example, was
yes.
the most obvious. But overall, I found it interesting.
Okay, good. Any other sort of general comments or anything that you have particular passages that you want us to look at, or want me to go into a bit more detail about, sort of set an agenda so we all get sort of the most out of the session?
I think, Chris, that occurred to me, I was sort of vaguely familiar with it, I should say. What's nice this time, it's a long time since I looked at it, and I'm not, to be honest, sure how much I got from it this time, which was a long time ago. But what I liked this time is, I think, because it seems so applicable to the and what read the text and so looking at, I think that helped to sort of unpick it. But the thing that I should have, when you emailed yesterday, one of the things that I'm now thinking, I wish I had done it, was the idea that at the start of the essay is he talks about, I think it's Jench, isn't it?
Yes.
He sort of, Jench had linked the Uncanny to intellectual uncertainty. And then at the end of the essay, sort of dismissed that. I think Freud, it seemed to me, kind of dismissed it, moved on, talked about what he thinks. And then it kind of comes back at the end, completely different, which I thought was interesting. And then the little bits of sort of secondary reading that I just started to dip into. There's a lot about, the uncanny and sense of uncertainty. How I sort of think about it as well. So I think, to the point, I'm just interested in what your thoughts might be, and perhaps we can come to it later on. Freud is up to there, because I sort of felt like he's just on the one hand, but it just feels like it's quite fundamental to certainly how I ended up thinking about the uncanny.
Yes. So this is the sort of the witness of the essay itself is quite odd. The way in which you're absolutely right. He dismisses that notion that the uncanny is this sense of intellectual uncertainty, and then he keeps coming back to it, especially in the section when he is discussing Hoffman and the son, and he keeps going back and forth on that question actually quite a bit. So there's a bit where he talks about there's a weird effect where we don't know whether what we're seeing from Nathaniel's point of view in the Sandman is it really happening, or is simply a hallucination that is having. At that point, Freud does seem to be embodying this idea of the uncanny as a kind of intellectual uncertainty. Then at the end of The Song of the Sandman, he says, he goes back to his original position of, this is something more than intellectual uncertainty. And I'm right, especially towards the end, it begins to creep back in, because that's where he's obviously then talking about the role of the uncanny in literature, and the way in which things that seem uncanny in literature don't cause the same effect as things that are uncanny in real life. There's a sense in which literature, a degree of literature, acts as this or fiction. We expect weird stuff to happen in fiction precisely because it is fiction, not so much in the real world. But that begs the question of, well, he's already been using a fictional example of the Sandman throughout most of his essay to make this point. So coming back to the question about the sort of the weakness of the way in which Freud seems to sort of double back on himself into definitely not this, and then by the end of the essay he seems to be occupying another position entirely. A lot of interesting work that's been done on this by Nicholas Royal, actually, in his book on Uncanny, where Royal has this reading of the essay as itself sort of representing that sense of uncanniness and uncertainty that Freud is describing. So the way in which the argument often doubles back on itself, the way in which it seems quite inclusive. It sort of comes to a sort of a rather abrupt end, and we're thinking, we're sort of left in that of uncertainty. It's also a weird essay in as much as it sort of contradicts itself in other ways. So, for instance, there's that section near the beginning, actually, where Freud confesses that those feelings of uncertainty, those feelings of weirdness and oddity, are not really the original ground for psychoanalytic discussion. And he actually admits let me just get my copy. He admits on page 220. He says, the present contribution must himself plead guilty to a special obtuseness in the matter of the uncanny, where extreme delicacy of perception would be more in place. It's long since he has experienced or heard of anything which gave him an uncanny impression, and he must start by translating himself into that state of feeling, by awakening in himself the possibility of experiencing it. We got at the essay Freud arguing that I don't really know much about the uncanny myself. I'm having to transplant myself into the mind of someone who's experienced this. And end of the essay, he's drawing on these personal anecdotes. He's drawing on this weird story of him walking around the town in Italy and experiencing uncanny. We think, well, hold on. So you said at the beginning that you this is an imaginative exercise that you were having to put into the mind of another. So the whole essay, I think, is this really interesting exercise in intellectual uncertainty. It says one thing, but it does another. And that's really interesting. It might be something we can sort of think about a bit later in the session. Was from anyone or any other questions or queries or passages that people wanted us to look at over the course of the. Anything else? Okay, I think that means then that we shall get going with things. We do just a very quick announcement that Charlotte Boyce has asked me to make. So the webinar next week for Fifth Skills and Approaches is taking place at a slightly different time. So and I understand that Charlotte had asked everyone on the course to indicate a preference for what time would be best, and she's just informed me that it will be Thursday 6 till 8. Next Thursday 6 till 8 will be the on the abject. What we're doing in these two seminars is looking at two sort of theoretical pieces which crop up in virtually all or most criticism of Victorian Gothic. It'd be very rare sort of book on the Victorian Gothic that didn't mention or read something through an uncanny framework. And likewise, Kristeva's Abject is in many ways a response to Freud, not necessarily to uncanny in particular, but certainly to Freudian ideas of phobia and uncanniness. So that's really these 2 weeks sort of go together. So next week then, Thursday 6 to 8 will be the on the project. So I'll get started then on the sort of the lecture section, and I'm not going to presume too much in terms of previous experience of Freud or of the uncanny, because I'm aware that well, hopefully you've read it, but some of you will have some depth and some won't. So this is sort of by way of a sort of a basic introduction into the uncanny. I think most are very familiar, of course, with the Freudian model of mind, which division to the conscious mind and the unconscious. I think we're all sort of fairly familiar with that Freudian model. Conscious, of course, being that realm of language, of rational thought, of being aware, or actions, being of identity, of selfhood, and of course articulates this existence of an unconscious, that realm of the mind that we cannot access, that we cannot directly perceive, because of course it is beyond language, it's beyond representation, it is something that precedes language or precedes representation. So the only way we can access the unconscious is through dreams, so through sort of the analysis, the interpretation of dreams, through slips of the tongue, so the famous Freudian slip, where we say something else that we didn't consciously mean to, but somehow embodies some kind of unconscious desire. And this is really the basis of the Freudian uncanny. To get at what Freud is arguing in the uncanny, this is really where we need to start, in this sort of idea of the self not as unified, not as unitary, as that we are always obvious to ourselves, but in the sense of selfhood as being divided into conscious and unconscious, and the sort of the way in which things can cross that boundary, that sort of red line on the presentation there. So then to Freud's essay then on the uncanny as a working out of this relationship between the conscious and the unconscious mind. And here, as you've probably gleaned, is really interested in all those things that we are talking about on the Victorian Gothic age. So many of you have already noted that this is particularly relevant to the content of what we're looking at on the course. So Freud's really interested in those ideas, in those experiences, not necessarily of fear, not necessarily of fear of something which could be a stud or something scary, but rather, for want of a better word, what we might call weirdness, or what we might call creepiness. That idea, those ideas of being uneasy about something, but where unease doesn't have an obvious referent or doesn't to an obvious threat. So, classic examples of this I've listed there that Freud talks about, so especially doubles and doppelgangers, déjà vu, which is also related to what Freud talks about in terms of repetition as well. Freud is really interested in this essay about really interested in uncanny repetition, in coincidences, in those weird moments where we keep sort of coming up against the same name or number in our day-to-day lives. And dolls as well, and waxworks and robots, which is actually where the sort of the Gentian definition of the uncanny comes in. I have that later term now of that crops up in film, in effects design, in computer games, of the uncanny valley. When something is slightly too realistic. It's a representation which is not clearly a image of something, but is also not quite clearly the thing itself. It's sort of something in between. And I mean, it's not actually Freud's term; it's much later, but it does derive from the kind of thing that Freud and Jensch are talking about. So, then to outline some of the key ideas, or some of the ideas that I find particularly interesting in the Uncanny. You've got a lovely goal to look at while I'm talking. So a large part of Freud's method here is a response to previous psychoanalysts, is a response to sort of previous writings on the Uncanny. And we've already actually in the preliminary discussion so I'm sure you'll recall that reads Ernst Jentsch's call and his explanation for the Uncanny, and especially the sort of the uncanniness of dolls and things, is the idea of intellectual uncertainty. So it's doubt of, as paraphrasing Jentsch, doubts whether an apparently animate being is really alive or conversely where a lifeless object might not be in fact animate. And the classic examples here that I'm sure we're all familiar with are sort of, wax figures and dolls, robots, automata, presentations of humans that are a bit too realistic, and so on. So that's sort of the starting point, and I for one of the starting points for discussion, many of the uncanny effects of this article itself, usually in which it has these multiple starting points. We start off with experience and with the pages that Freud spends on dictionary definitions, and then this idea of intellectual uncertainty. And what's interested in Jentsch's explanation of the uncanny, he does think it lacks something. He thinks that actually there are a good many the uncanny that cannot be explained by reference to this idea of intellectual uncertainty. And as we've just been discussing, he does this idea of intellectual uncertainty sort of enters by the back door, sneaks back in toward the end of the end of the article. To go into the article, I think what Freud is missing in his explanation is this idea, or to understand what is missing, we need to return to this idea of home, of homeliness, because that's actually begins or earlier on in the essay. He starts with this weird sort of etymological action, all of those dictionary definitions of the uncanny in Heimlich, to use the German phrase, actually translates into English as homely, so as belonging to the home. So we've got here, and I think we should always be thinking about the metaphors that he uses as well. So not just the argument that he's making, but so the way in which he makes the argument, the metaphors that he uses, and not article, but also throughout analytic work. He's fascinated with architectural metaphors, the metaphors of homeliness, of the conscious as being rooms that we live in, that we work in, that we the unconscious, some kind of basement or space underneath that. So I think that's worth thinking about. The domestic metaphor that Freud often uses. So he begins then with the essay with this etymological explanation of the term and Heimlich, which translates into belonging to the home, homely, the domestic. He'd look at the element of this term, and he sort of finds something quite interesting, that actually, when the terms Heimlich and unheimlich start to converge, actually they can be used interchangeably in certain situations. I suppose really the close we have the equivalent in English is something like flammable and inflammable. Sound like opposites, but actually mean the same thing. It's not quite the same thing, but I suppose it's the closest English example that we have. So we are looking at these extracts from dictionaries, sort of trying to define in the rather initially quite banal way, basically what is the uncanny by looking it up in the dictionary. And he finds this sort of weirdness. He says, what interests most in this long extract of etymologies and so on is to find that among its shades of meaning, that Heimlich exhibits one which is identical with its opposite, unheimlich. What is Heimlich thus comes to be unheimlich. We are reminded that the word Heimlich is not an ambiguous but belongs to two sets of ideas, which, without being contradictory, are yet very different. On the one hand, it means what is familiar and agreeable, and on the other, what is sealed and kept out of sight. So I think this is interesting as well, because what we have here is Freud sort of using, he's making a point here about language as well. This is about the only as inscribed in the structure of language itself. So not simply something which is represented by language, but this uncanny effect which is embodied in the language itself. This also then leads into this idea that uncanny is not something which is completely strange to us. This weirdness is not something which is completely unknown. This, I think, is sometimes a way in which students, especially undergraduate students, having taught this several times, I think just tend to misread the essay as Freud saying the uncanny is what's unfamiliar. The uncanny is what is new or completely unknown to us, and that's actually Freud saying something much subtler than that, which is actually that it's both familiar and yet familiar at the same time. It is something that we recognize, but we don't know why we recognize it, and creates sort of a division in the self, which is then uncanny, which is then our sense of self. Of course, the best example of this is, of course, déjà vu. Sense that we've been in this place before, we've been in this situation before, but we don't know why. We don't know how we. So it also leads us into the idea of doubling as well, which came up, and we can discuss later. So this idea of the uncanny double. This is the other that Freud is responding to in ways. There is a in which the uncanny is a sort of a belated in as much as Freud is really aware that he's responding to people who've already made arguments. He's sort of doubling himself with people who have previously explored this and trying to come out a place for himself. What he's responding to as well is Otto Rank and Rank's argument about the double. So I just want to quickly move through this model of Rank's deal the double, because I think there is a neatness to it, and I think also it is a lot of what Rank is, or of what Freud is talking about. So Freud is slightly unconvinced by Jentsch's expression of the uncanny as intellectual uncertainty, because it lacks that temporal dimension. It lacks sense of the uncanny as the return of the repressed, which is the famous phrase that Freud uses sort of later on in text. So the uncanny is that which has been repressed and then has come to light, which of course Jentsch's model of the uncanny as intellectual uncertainty doesn't have. Lacks. Doesn't have any sense that this is something that's come back from the past. So therefore much more interested in Otto Rank's model of uncanny, and this is where the double comes in. So Rank, and what I've got on the screen here, so Rank first of all prepare of the infant, of the child as an individual. And basically, Rank argues that what the child does is, as a defense against death, as a defense against harm, a child fantasizes about a copy of himself. So where the double originates, that the child is theorizing or fantasizing about another copy of us, which sort of makes sense, because it's if there are two of us, if one of us gets killed, there'll be another one live on. It's kind of a splitting of self into so far then we can so far we can sort of see the logic of ranks here. That the double is initially a defense against harm, against death, against eradication, and so on. Goes on to say, or goes on to argue, and again in a quite Freudian vein, that as a child, life as the child develops and is adulthood, we leave this double behind. We actually repress it. This idea of the double gets repressed. We basically forget this developmental stage whereby we fantasized about this other copy of ourselves who would act in a sort of a protective capacity. Then, I think, is that when we come back face to face with the double, whether that's meeting someone in the street who is a complete others, or if we see as identical twins, or anything that challenges the idea we have of ourselves as unique, as unified individuals, or so on, that we recognize the double ourselves, but we don't quite recognize the whole content which we first fantasized about that self. And we forget is actually what was a defense against death is that we forget that sort of positive aspect of it. Forget that aspect of it that this is a defense. This is a thing. This is a positive thing. This is something that was going to act on our behalf. And we remember, according to the double, is somehow associated with the idea of harm. Is associated with the idea of death. So in that sense, then the double becomes its opposite. What a defense now becomes an attack, now becomes a threat to us. All we remember is that this faces who might harm us, who can actually take our place. We can, and we see this theme of the uncanny twin worked out quite obviously in cinema, in modern sort of gothic film of the twin who wants to take place. That's basically Ranks' argument regarding the uncanniness of the double. And sort of on this, I think Freud finds this certainly a more convincing model than of because it has that temporal dimension. It is about the return of the repressed. So Freud builds on what Rank said by emphasizing then the uncanny as the familiar but in a changed context. In many ways, one of the most sentences from the uncanny is this claim that Freud makes that the unreality, nothing new or alien, but something which is familiar and old established in the mind, and which has become alienated from it only through the process of repression. This then is why really interested in the uncanniness of repetition, of thinking familiar that we shouldn't find familiar. The example that he gives, for instance, of getting lost in that town in Italy and instantly returning to the same square, or like some sort of repetition. Then to understand Freud's essay on the uncanny in terms of his wider work on death drive and on what motives us as individuals. Freud's earlier psychoanalytic work is very much based on what he calls the principle, which is very understood in utilitarian terms as we seek pleasure. Our dreams are wish fulfillments. We seek that which is pleasurable. We seek that which we enjoy, which sort of meets our physical and physiological emotional needs. Then, after the First World War, Freud is faced with the question of trauma. He's the question of, well, if humans only seek pleasure, why have traumatic experience? why do we feel this necessity to repeat or to replay in our minds experiences that have been traumatic, so, shell shock and so on. So this is where then in the early 20th century we get Freud in a book Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Our pleasure principle is not enough to explain the human psyche. We have to have what he calls this death drive, repetition, compulsion. This compulsion to repeat things, to obsessively relay things in our head, the desire to go back to an earlier state of being, the sort of drives that Freud is that's theorizing in the context of his essay on the uncanny. So to bring it back then to the idea of the uncanny and to the idea of the Gothic, whatever reminds us then of compulsion to repeat or remembers of that earlier stage of being is perceived as uncanny, that destabilizes our sense of self, that reminds us that actually, there is an stage of being that we have repressed, that has popped up from the unconscious into the conscious mind, something that we find familiar, but we're not quite sure why we find it familiar. I do think we might want to think about in the discussion as well is sort of the method that's used here, because I already mentioned actually the one which a number of later critics of the uncanny, so especially Nicholas Royal, for instance, in his book on the uncanny, which these critics have often seen the form of essay as embodying the kind of repetition compulsions and the kind of uncanniness that it describes. So I'm interested also then in something we might consider the method which Freud makes this argument. So I've mentioned the etymological aspect of the fact that actually Freud is sort of trying to make a case for the uncanny as something inscribed in language, nothing simply incidental to language or incidental to thought, but actually inscribed within the process of language itself, or at least in German, the way in which the term Heimlich turns into its opposite. We also have Freud's emphasis on literary analysis as well, because for a piece of sort of psychoanalytic writing, for a piece of logical writing, there's an awful lot of literary criticism in it. We have these references to things like the myth of the ring of Polycrates. We have, most of the essay is an extensive analysis of the Sandman, often story, and Freud sort of spins this rather elaborate reading of Hoffman as being about castration anxiety. So he talks a lot about eyes and the fear of losing eyes as representative of castration anxiety, which is probably the aspect of Freud's argument which is aged the least effectively. I think the castration complex has not sort of fared well in sexual history since Freud proposed it. You mentioned you've got the responses as well to previous psychoanalytic works, so the sort of the dismissal or not of gentian and sexual uncertainty, and then the building on Otto Rank, which Freud sort of finds slightly more convincing, and also, as I've mentioned as well, this idea of personal anecdote, which again is operating in a very paradoxical way, I think, in this essay. So on the one hand, Freud draws on his personal experiences of the uncanny, but at the article has basically said, well, I haven't encountered this in some time. I've got to put myself to the position of somebody who's encountered these things. And I think Nicholas Royal, again, makes a really interesting point about that, which actually what we get, Freud doubling himself. I've got to imagine what it's like to experience these things. I've got to project a sort of a spectral image of myself and experiencer of the uncanny and of uncanny phenomena to try and understand it. So there's a doubling that goes on under Freud as author. to as well, and just to sort of open up these questions for sort of further discussion. So I've mentioned Royal quite already, but in many ways his reading of Freud's essay is one of the most important, I think, for in modern empiric theory. It looks at Freud's essay from a number of different angles. Freud's influence on thinkers and later philosophers like Derrida, for instance, spectres of Marx. But Freud interested in the relationship between the uncanny and literature and culture as well. So Freud, Hoffman, Nicholas Royal, that's the one I'm after. Roy says about Freud's reading of Hoffman, he says that what the reading of the Sandman shows, above all perhaps, is the uncanny is a reading effect. It is simply in the Hoffman text as a theme, spot the uncanny object in this text, that can be noted and analysed accordingly. Roy goes on to suggest that actually what Freud's argument shows is that the uncanny is a ghostly feeling that arises or doesn't arise, an experience that comes about or doesn't as an effect of reading. It is the very impossibility of a so-called thematic reading. So the point here is that we can look at literary texts and we can pick out, we can do that reading of picking out what is uncanny in an Arthur Conan Doyle story or an Arthur Morrison story or so on. That also sort of misses the point, because the uncanniness is also in the act of reading as well. As I just mentioned, the fact that Freud is actively doubling himself as, on the one hand, an objective psychologist, a psychoanalyst, and on the other hand, as somebody who, a sort of a fictionalized version of himself who's experienced uncanny. Likewise, the act of reading also has a sort of uncanny quality to it as well, because reading the work of a writer who is there and isn't there at the same time. So being sort of uncanny and distancing in the act of reading itself. Likewise, Roy says that uncanny is not actually a literary genre in itself, and I suppose this also relates back to the discussion we had on the forum about the Gothic, and about the difficulty of being down the Gothic. Is it something as a Gothic genre, or is it something that overflows ideas of genre and form? So the uncanny is not a literary genre, but nor is it a non-literary genre. It overflows the very institution of literature. It inhabits, pauses, parasitizes the allegedly non-literary in genre blink. So Roy is really interested as well in this idea of how Freud, the uncanny, arguments about the uncanny, also in our sense of self, in addition to reminding us that we have an unconscious, that we have a repressed, but it's also about destabilizing that boundary between fiction and non-fiction, between psychoanalysis and literature, and thinking about how we might complicate reading of. I'm sort of going to leave that sort of introductory lecture. Hopefully that's sort of explained or clarified points of what Freud is getting at. But there may be other questions, and we can also think about this question already raised of literary uncertainty. We've also got those questions that were on also, so what is Freud's argument with relation to the uncanny? So we might think about the importance of the image of the home and the homely, the levels on which that image of home operates. The uncanny suggests about our sense of self. Freud makes in between his argument and previous psychoanalytic arguments of discussion of discussions of uneasiness and fear, and so the kinds of evidence, sort of the method by Freud makes this argument, makes this analysis. sort of the things I'm interested in, but there may be others that we want to discuss. I think a way into this would be think about. First of all, have we? Because actually, a couple of you mentioned that there were things in this essay that you recognised. There were things that you picked up on relating to personal experience. I don't mean into some sort of Freudian therapy session or anything like that. But are there experiences of the uncanny that you have directly you feel sort of speak to or resonate with what Freud is saying here? Has any experiences of uncanniness that have a resonance with Freud's article?
Deja vu is the most obvious and probably the one everybody's experienced. As going through the examples, that was the part of the essay for me that sort of resonated. So, vu, repetition, the examples, is opposed to the castration argument, which I just couldn't buy into at all. As you referenced. For me, was the bit where it's like, that I can appreciate that.
I mean, the castration stuff is interesting. I also think it's because something else I think we need to consider as well are sort of the limitations of the Freudian argument and the limitations of the Freudian picture. And I feel like the castration anxiety material, it does. I mean, it feels to me, and especially in that reading of Hoffman's Sandman, that act of the Sandman seems actually to foreground that idea of intellectual necessity and the effects that come about through that. So not necessarily the uncanny effects of what is narrated in the plot, not necessarily the uncanny events of the story, but actually the uncanniness arises from our own sense of uncertainty over the status of what it is we're reading. So this goes back to Royal's point that actually the uncanniness doesn't reside so much in the text, but rather in how we interpret that text and so kind of a dialogue between text and reader. And I do feel that with the reading of Hoffman and saying the example of eyes in Hoffman is clearly a representative castration anxiety, and I do wonder if that is really Freud is sort of determination to see cavity somewhere, and already predetermined that as constitutive of the self and of the Freudian self. So I agree. It does feel slightly stretched. The déjà vu example is really interesting. And if you're interested in sort of following up on this, actually, there's really interesting critical work that's been done on déjà vu and the idea of déjà vu and how that relates to memory and selfhood. So there's actually a book by an Italian theorist called Paolo Verno called Vu and of History. And Verno doesn't necessarily discuss déjà vu from a Freudian perspective. He's interested in this idea of déjà vu in terms of totality and how we engage with time and how we stand. And there's an interesting point that Verno makes in that discussion of déjà vu, which is that whenever we get a sense of déjà vu, we've experienced this before. The uncanniness of that is that we never get a sense of exactly when we experience that thing. We never sort of, or at least I certainly don't. I don't know about anyone else, but certainly when I have those experiences of deja vu, I think, oh yes, this is exactly like June, or this is exactly like 2 weeks ago. Is that sense of this is basically the past. It's a sort of a general idea of memory, of historicity, of something that happened in us. So it's never attached, I think, to a specific moment in the past, just sort of to an idea of memory or the past in general, which also in the Freudian relates perfectly to the idea of the turn of the repressed. The idea that the uncanny is something that has popped up out of our mind, and which settles us because it reminds us that there is somewhere else in our psyche that we can't access. I agree. The deja vu material is sort of a very vivid example of that, and maybe less convincing than the deletion anxiety material. Does anyone sort of have personal experiences of uncanniness that we might use to sort of unpick or donate with certain Freud's essay we might use to sort of get into a bit more detail? Or actually about other cultural texts, how you might see this sort of working with other or novels, whatever.
Mirrors.
Yep.
So I've never liked mirrors, and even now I tend to not have them in my room. And I can definitely, this is turning into a psychotherapy session. I can remember like having to stay at like or other people's houses, and I think that even quite big and difficult mirrors for people to move needed to be covered up or moved. And I hated looking at myself and was waiting for that reflection to, it was actually conscious and was looking at me and do something different. Idea that what I was looking at when I was looking at a reflection or conscience sort of being there, I was just looking at a reflected me. But kind of the longer you'd make yourself do it, because that's the other thing, isn't it? You hate doing it. What you end up doing, you sort of do it more because there's sort of fascination with it. You're almost tempting, almost willing it to sort of to always hated mirrors, and I think that sort of inside outside other time tips. I think to some extent.
Actually, the whole mirror thing is that's the thing. So obviously, from a Freudian perspective, obviously we've got that idea of also that potential that person in the mirror. Well, two things here. Firstly, that okay, the person in the mirror is obviously a copy of us and can't really do anything that we're not doing, but has the potential to do so. Moment of thinking, well, will the reflection in the mirror do something else? Will it act in a way that I haven't or I don't have my own volition? The other well with the mirror is that sense of you're not quite recognizing the person there as well, and this is something I've sort of experienced as well. This the idea of thinking that, well, the person I'm looking at in the mirror, is that really do sort of an equivalent to the kind of person I am with my interior thoughts and my interior psyche. So yes, there's absolutely that sense of an uncanny doubling of something actually. Something that is unfamiliar that should be familiar as well, of not quite recognizing yourself in the mirror. And actually, bringing this back to Victorian Gothic, bringing this back to literary studies as well. this image of the mirror, of not quite recognizing yourself in the mirror. This is an image that crops up a lot in Victorian fiction. So there are two sort of prominent examples of it I can think of off the top of my head. Firstly, in Dickens's Bleak House, which is a novel, we're not reading it on the course, but it's a novel which is thoroughly bound up with desires of uncanniness and alienation from oneself and a failure to recognise oneself. A couple of scenes in Bleak House where one of the characters, Esther Summerson, looked at herself in a mirror and doesn't quite recognise who's there. She should. She knows that there's a mirror. It's a mechanism for confirming herself, but actually, it's acting in that very sort of uncanny way. The other example that immediately springs to mind is Charlotte Bronte's Villette. Snow in that novel, scene in the novel where she's at a ball or a dance and she's walking downstairs and she is looking at a facing staircase with this other beautiful woman walking down. And then he says later that actually she's looking in a mirror, that actually the woman that she's been assessing from afar is actually herself. And it's really interesting actually, because she describes it as a gift. She describes it as sort of the ability to sort of this step outside of oneself and see what others see us. Whereas for Dickens, it's much more of an uncanny moment of not recognizing the double. In many ways, on one hand, you've got the person you do recognize, but you don't know why, and then you've got the person you don't recognize, but you, and that sort of lends itself to a kind of distancing. We've also, the use of the mirror in Richard Kahn as well, and the mirror state of psychoanalysis of the child realizing that he or she is a separate identity by recognizing him or herself in the mirror. But the whole other sort of complex area that we don't sort of have time to tend to today. But yes, certainly it's sort of really interesting in that regard. We deal with space as well, a way in which it's not just the self that is doubled, but also how space is doubled in the mirror as well. So Michel Foucault, in his article of Other Spaces, talks about what he calls a heterotopia. So a sort of a space which exists doesn't exist as well. If you look at it in a mirror, it's in there, but it's in there at the same time because you're basically looking at a flat reflection of it. So mirrors are absolutely these sort of destabilizing Gothic, as it were. And the other sort of examples of uncanniness that people like to share with us, or any sort of other questions arising from what we've just okay. If everyone can see Kate, because Kaylee's microphone isn't working at the moment. She's put something up on the chat, which I think is just to me, so I don't know if everyone can see this. I'll read it out for everyone's benefit. But Kate says, I guess when you go to somewhere late at night that you wouldn't, like going into a school or library when it's dark out or practically empty, it feels eerie. Yeah, but in a light you've never seen it before. It promotes a feeling of unease and desire to leave. Yeah, absolutely. So again, that sense of the familiar rendered unfamiliar, the familiar sort of rendered anew or alienated from us in some way. So then linked to, which is something that I'm not sure that Freud talked about in his article. The imitation of Freud's assessment of uneasiness and quick fear and so on, which is the kind of what I call sort of the self-reflexive nature of Uncanny. So any example there of the space that you don't quite recognize. It was uncanny because you're aware of it, or you're aware of yourself feeling it as an uncanny space, as a slightly disquieting space. And sort of pull yourself together and sort of rationally, you sort of again become aware that you are not acting in a particularly rational way, and that in many ways harms the sensation. At least this is I'm sort of looking at it. So the idea in which uncanniness begets uncanniness. It comes back to that idea of thinking that this is sort of easy, but it's really, and we should be better than this. But actually, it is having that effectiveness. That also leads into another aspect of Freud's article, which I mentioned yet, actually, but I will get on to in the second part of the seminar. We're sort of approaching 4 o'clock or so. I think what would be useful actually is maybe to sort of have a quick sort of 10-minute break, so we can sort of gather thoughts and think a bit further and sort of grab a cup of tea or whatever. So we'll think a bit more about this idea of the return of the depressed. We'll think a bit more about intellectual uncertainty and whether Freud is justified in sort of getting rid of that idea so rapidly, and whether it does think back into what he's thinking about the uncanny. And also we'll sort of deal with any other sort of questions or queries that people might have. So if that's okay with everybody, we'll sort of have a quick break, and then we'll resume at about 4. So it gives us sort of about 10 minutes to sort of grab a cup of tea or whatever. Okay, so we're back at last. Okay. Okay, is that?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Can you all see the? I put up the PDF of the Uncanny as well on the screen, so hopefully everybody should be able to see that as well. Not.
See that you put a screen up, but it's just sort of like mock.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Me take that in, because obviously that's not quite working. Okay, it's not essential. I just thought it might be useful to have the copy of the text up on the screen, but obviously if it's not for some reason, then we shall leave it. So what we raised was this idea of intellectual uncertainty as a definition or an understanding of the uncanny. So this idea of chiz. So this idea then that we find sort of dolls and automata creepy because we're not quite sure if they're alive or dead, sort of in the middle, and then the question of whether is right to reject this reading of Gentry's, or whether actually he sort of sneaks it back in. And I think you'd said that you had the sense that it sort of begins to reintroduce this idea towards the end of the article. I don't know if you want to sort of say a bit more about your thinking on that, over the particular moment in the article where that happens, or.
I'll have a go. I think partly it was because I was willing him to bring it back in because he seems to be understood the uncanny or had experienced it. I wanted it to be there. I thought it does come back in because if I find the bit right at the end, I think the time he specifically mentioned it's question, isn't it? I want to think that the last thing he says is in something along the lines of, can we entirely discount it? Kind of drops it, and that's sort of left with the lingering question. But then, I think what caused me to ask it was because of the way that he chooses to finish the piece. So you're sort of thrown into that sort of solitude and darkness bit. My kind of being left in uncertainty.
Yes. So the way in which the essay ends is really quite odd. So the final is concerning the factors of silence, solitude, and darkness, that they are actually elements in the production of the infantile anxiety from which the majority of human beings have never become quite free. This problem has been discussed from a psychoanalytic point of view elsewhere. So this is where he's sort of raising ideas of ideas of the dark, which is similar to the example that Kaylee brought up, but it's a sort of slightly different thing. Kaylee's example is more to do with a familiar place becoming unfamiliar rather than becoming obscured or rather than becoming dark. Yeah, I think you're right. There is in the way in which Freud argument, he sets out all these explanations for why we find things uncanny or why we find things unsettling, and then toward the final few pages actually are really there's a lot of uncertainty about them, because he then starts loading his article with all of these qualifiers, all these qualifications. And suddenly we start thinking, well, hold on, Freud. We had a very clearly worked out model of uncanny double early on in the article, and everything sort of seemed to flow with a logic. And even though we may not sort of buy the castration anxiety expert in the Sandman, we can see the logical steps by which Freud is making that argument. And then I think at the end we suddenly get and this is really wild PDF up. So basically admitting that a lot of these arguments or a lot of these analyses don't quite work in certain situations. All these arguments don't quite apply to certain situations. So, for instance, on page 249, we get the uncanny as it's depicted in literature, in stories and imaginative productions, merits and truth for separate discussion. It's a much more fertile province than the uncanny in real life. It contains the whole of the latter and something more besides, something that cannot be found in real life. So immediately, we're sort of moving from Freud to give us a framework for understanding the uncanny as a concept. It's only saying, well, actually, if we want to consider the uncanny in literature, then we have to have a whole essay. We have to have a whole other discussion. He makes this distinction between the world of literature, which clearly sort of fictionalized. He talks about the way which you can't have uncanny effects in fairy stories, because those stories take place in a world which is all over the fantastical. So we're sort of ready for anything. It's a world where anything is possible. We can't really have the uncanny in literature or in sort of fantastic literature. It has to be something that takes place in the real world where it would seem out of place. So he talks also on again the same page 249, actually, just after the bit I just quoted. So he said he talks about the realm of fantasy. The realm of fantasy depends for its effect on the fact that its content is not submitted to reality testing. The final result is that, in the first place, a great deal that is not uncanny in fiction, if it happened in real life, and in place that there are many more means of creating uncanny effects in fiction than there are in real life, which seems sort of paradoxical almost. On the one hand, Freud seems to be saying, well, yes, can't really happen in fiction, especially in fantastical fiction, because we're deep for it, because that takes place in a realm which already where the supernatural can already happen. And yet he's also saying that actually there are far more effects for creating the uncanny in literature, or many more means of creating uncanny effects in fiction than there are in real life. So then this type of reality testing as well, of the uncanny as something which sort of tugs at the edges of reality, sense of reality. Something else that Freud talks about a lot, actually, as an example of uncanniness, is the idea of omnipotence of thought. Is thing which, let me see if I can just find the correct passage. Basically, yes, this is page sort of 239 on, where he's talking about the ring of Polycrates, the sort of the story of Egypt turning away in horror from his host Polycrates, because he sees that his friend's every wish is at once fulfilled, his every care promptly removed by kindly fate. His host has become uncanny to him. And Bill sees this uncanny story of this guy who has everything he wishes for delivered to him as being uncanny, because he sees this as an example of what Freud calls the omnipotence of thought. So basically, this is the idea that something we think of comes in. So we only need to think of something, and it will affect the exterior world. So it's a bit like the uncanniness of if you think of, for instance, somebody, an old friend who you haven't spoken to So there it is, and then the phone rings at that point, and you pick it up, and it's them, and you haven't seen them in about 10 years or so. That is uncanny, Freud suggests, not simply because it's a coincidence, because there are loads of coincidences that aren't especially uncanny, but rather because it seems to suggest that your internal thought processes are omnipotent, have the power to shape the world around you. You think of a person, and they are compared to sort of call up or sort of enter into your life in some other way. I was really interested then in this idea of the omnipotence of thought and how that acts in an uncanny way. In firstly, down that boundary between self and world, as individuals sort of insulated from the world, separate from the world, and so suddenly this idea that just when the exterior world change sort of destabilizes that sense of self we have. But the other aspect in which Freud finds that uncanny, and the other aspect I wanted to bring in as well, is this idea of simply the uncanny as the return of the actual, so what we've repressed in terms of growing up as people. But there's also evolutionary language as well. So it talks a lot towards the end of this article about the uncanny as the return of beliefs which pressed as a civilization. So, for instance, on page 2, where is it? Yes, 242, for instance. Freud is talking about the fear of the dead and of ghosts, and why we find that sort of spooky and spectral and those sort of responses to it. And rather than this in the sort of the normal Gothic terms of a fear of a spectral other, Freud is of that have developed as a culture. So he says, and the bottom of page 242. So he's basically referring to spiritualism and the growth of spiritualism in the earlier century. Our great cities, placards announce lectures that undertake to tell us how to get into touch with the souls of the departed. And it can't be denied that not a few of the most able and penetrating minds among our men of science have come to the conclusion, especially towards the close of their own lives, that a contact of this kind is not impossible. Since almost all of us still think as savages do on this topic, it is matter for surprise that the primitive fear of the dead is still so strong within us and always ready to come to the surface on any provocation. Most fear still implies the old belief that the dead man becomes the enemy of his survivor and seeks to carry him off to share his new life with him. So it's rather similar to Ranke's model of the double. In our unchanged attitude towards death, we might rather inquire what has become of the repression, which is a necessary condition of a primitive feeling purring in the shape of something uncanny. But repression there too, all supposedly educated people have ceased to believe officially that the dead can become visible spirits and have made any appearances dependent on improbable and remote conditions. So what Wolf is saying here is that it's not simply the evidence of ghosts, which is the return of the repressed, but actually that sort of return to an earlier stage of being. Is using here sort of a really quite dramatic language of savagery versus civilization, or in believing in ghosts, that becomes uncanny, but actually, or ghosts become uncanny because we actually, without realizing it, reversing earlier state of understanding the world, of believing in the persistence of the dead, of believing in the persistence of spirits. This relates back to what we're saying about omnipotence of thought, that the idea that our own ideas can shape the world around us, because again for Freud, it's uncanny because it's relating back, or it is a recurrence of a belief in animal of being able to influence the world in that. So that question of intellectual uncertainty, it seems like we've sort of taken a bit of a detour here. But I think you're right. There's a sense in which he introduces intellectual uncertainty, that intellectual uncertainty over whether, do my thoughts affect the world around me? And of course, I think, well, no, of course they don't, because I'm a civilized, rational human being. But then you think at the back of your mind, well, no, does it? Does it really? Is that sense of doubt? So actually, I do feel that there's Freud is a bit impotent, I think, in sort of dismissing this idea of intellectual uncertainty as a form of the uncanny. The other that strikes me about this as well is go back and have a look at Freud's language as well in this piece. The way in which he's often seems to be in doubt himself, actually, at several points. So, for instance, and it is after, I think, section discussing the Sandman, and we're discussing Hoffman's story. So this is on page 230. This is just after Freud has summarized Hoffman's story. And there's a telling moment, actually, in Freud's writing here, where he himself seems subject to exactly this kind of uncertainty or this kind of self-doubt. Because he says after the Sandman, he says, "The short summary leaves no doubt, I think, that the feeling of something uncanny is directly attached to the figure of the Sandman, that is, to the idea of being robbed of one's eyes, and that just the point of an intellectual certainty has nothing to do with the effect." Now, I spoke a little bit earlier about the possible Freud's reading of Hoffman is maybe did by wish to find castration anxiety in it, but also the way in which the way he phrases that paragraph. This summary leaves no doubt, I think. Moment of uncertainty. He's really trying to sell this idea. Leaves no doubt. You have to believe this. You have to sort of take this on board, and then that sort of moment of, oh, I think. Be certain here, but again, there's that sense of doubt coming in, and immediately after that, he's saying, well, Gentry's point of intellectual uncertainty has nothing to do with the effect of the Sandman. There's a tone in which is written is I think really interesting. The way in which he's to this sense of intellectual certainty as being uncanny, but he himself uncertain himself at times, which leads to uncanny effect, as we've just seen of. I think that's a really interesting point, Paul, about you're willing him to complete this argument, willing him to this off, and this sort of not quite petering out, but sort of raising more questions than it answers. And are there other questions that people have, or other thoughts on this of intellectual uncertainty that Jesh suggests as being constitutive of uncanny? Are we Nietzsche's definition has some value to it, and maybe Freud is being a bit dismissed, gentle, or whatever sort of questions or questions about the article.
When I it,
Mm-hmm.
there's a crossover between what Jensen and Freud are saying in terms of things like the dolls and the waxworks, because I'm not scared of dolls, they don't freak me out, but as a child I was never freaked out by them, but can see the crossover in terms of literature and fiction and things like the films that we've been exposed to where you have dolls that are animated. That's probably what hacks the fear of us, rather than it's an external factor, I think, personally, that has brought an awareness that a doll can be free or rather than an innate feeling of them being a bit too like humans. So the couple of scenarios where I think actually it's more the impact that literature has had on us and fiction generally had on us in some of the cases of maybe things like the dark, like dolls, maybe even the idea of doubling.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what you're suggesting here then is that the idea of sort of the creepy doll and the idea of the creepy double is actually something that we have learned from culture, something that we've learned from literary texts, from film, from television, or whatever. So the culture becomes sort of the determines why we find these things creepy. Is that correct? Is that what have I understood that correctly?
Yeah, whether it's conscious or unconscious, but then I suppose taking it another level on is that it's sort of the egg section where are those films based on those topics, that they include those features because they know that we have them or we're freaked out by them.
Yeah, the question now, because I think there's a valuable point there, and I think there's this sort of dual relationship. I think so. Yes, our the fact that we find certain dolls creepy or certain images uncanny. Yeah, I think that's absolutely reinforced by the fact that we have exist in a culture which has already sort of trained us through film and television and so on to find those kind of things creepy. But then the flip side of that is, well, do those do the images stay with us? Are those images particularly effective because speaking to something that Freud sees or Jensch sees as inherent in us? And yeah, it does become that sort of irresolvable dialect, sort of that chicken and egg situation. I don't know. What do you think about this sort of? I mean, maybe we're speaking a lot about the terms of Freud's argument and sort of some of the details of it. Maybe when the sort of the final, should be thinking about how might we see this operating in other cultural examples. How can we use Freud to read film or television or novel, thinking how we might apply Freud to. I don't know if anyone has any sort of notions or thoughts about recognizing Freud in other artifacts. if there are any other queer or aspects of the article that you didn't or aware of or didn't quite get to grips with.
The concept of a lascivious intrauterine existence. Abstracts, I can't comprehend what he like a second to be unborn.
Yes. So let's have a look at that then. So that is let me see. This is page 200. I'm sorry. I should have said this at the outset. That all the page. I'm using the copy that is available on Moodle, so that you would do it on Moodle. You might be using another edition, Uncanny. I should have sort of made that clear a bit early on. But in terms of the PDF version available on Moodle, so this is page 244. Again, this is a moment where Freud is talking about a sort of Gothic motif that I think, again, we're sort of all familiar with in some form or other, either from film, from Edgar Allan Poe's fiction or whatever, or just from this weird phobic fear. So Freud says on page 244, some people, the idea of being buried alive by mistake is the most uncanny thing of all. And yet psychoanalysis has taught us that this terrifying fantasy is only a transformation of another fantasy, which has really nothing terrifying about at all, but qualified by a certain lasciviousness. The fantasy, I mean, of uterine existence. Yeah, it is a very weird moment, isn't it? This idea of not yet being born as being this lascivious experience. I mean, I think what's interesting about this moment, again, it's one of those sort of questionable points of Freud's article, and I've sort of raised this question a couple of times now of is this Freud sort of working out a logical uncanny, or in a sense in which he is trying to fit this into a prior structure that already exists in psychoanalysis of the attention compulsion and so on. Because on the top of it, I think actually it's quite real to fear being buried alive. I don't know about you, but I feel that sort of makes a great deal of sense actually to be frightened by that. But of course, Freud's essay on the uncanny is all about instances of fear or uncanniness. There isn't a logical explanation for it, where we feel uneasy or uncertain or uncanny or weird because of reasons that we can't quite pin down. So I think this moment is that actually I'm entirely convinced that this example of being buried alive really is essay, because as I just said, I think there are very reasonable and obvious reasons for for fearing being buried alive. I don't actually think it fits into the realm of the uncanny, at least to my mind. So we then get Freud sort of trying to justify this, and actually that this is the return of the repressed, and is it the return of the repressed of? Well, actually, the fear of being buried alive must therefore be, the memory of, or the repressed memory of being in the womb, of having this intrauterine existence. I do, to my mind, this is actually a weak point in Freud's essay. The lascivious aspect of it, I'm not quite so concerned with, because actually, this is familiar Freudian territory. The idea of the body of the mother in the additional sort of gushing experience, and then gets translated into sexual desire in that sort of classical people model. do other people sort of have any this moment, or the argument that the sort of the uncanny fear of being buried alive is really just a repressed memory of to return to the womb, or of being in the womb, reasonable, or do we sort of find it a bit odd? Do other people think of this?
God, being buried alive is enough. For me, that doesn't come from anything else. That's a terrifying idea. And the same for me. I felt exactly the same about the castration. The idea of losing your eyes is probably more scary than being buried alive. Because I feel like it's not being prompted by some other feeling with us. They're both terrifying things in their own sense.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think there are very actually rational grounds for losing one's eyes or being buried alive. So I think that's absolutely right. Of course, if Freud were here now, of course, argument then would be that actually we are in denial over these sort of repressed desires or these repressed fears. There is a certain limitation to psychoanalytic criticism in as much as the refutation of it brings in the Freudian method as sort of a reinforcement of it. So Freud was, well, okay, we're so afraid of a return to or the creation of losing one's eyes that we retrieve and countenance the idea. So in that sense, sort of becomes very difficult to argue against, but that in turn sort of maybe weakens it or questions it as an interpretive model. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's reasonable enough to sort of fear losing eyes without there necessarily having to be a sort of a repressive explanation. But I suppose what getting at here is that sort of weirdness of simply thinking about it would create, why, because there are lots of things that actually could happen to us. Idea of being buried alive certainly has a sort of greater fascination for dying, getting run over by a car, which would be equally sort of damage. Was Freud is interested in, well, why that particular image of harm more than other images of trauma or of harm. But yeah, I agree. It is a sort of an odd moment in essay. Any other thoughts on that, or any other or topics that we want to cover before leaving the Uncanny? Actually, just to follow up on just off that idea intrauterine existence. To the next page, of course, we also get a moment where this is talking about the female genitals as well as sort of being that homely place. He says it often it's on 245. It often happens that neurotic men declare that they feel there is something uncanny about the female genital organs. This heimlich place, however, is the entrance to the former home of all human beings, to the place where each one of us lived once upon a time and in the beginning. There was a Jing saying that love is homesickness, and whenever a man dreams of a place or a country and says to himself, while still dreaming, this place is familiar to me, I've been here before, we may interpret the place as being his mother's genitals or her body. So we've got that, bringing back that domestic metaphor, that metaphor of homeliness, of this being aligned with the domestic. And I think Freud's metaphors are always sort of very interesting. See, the image of home, of homeliness, is not a true image. It's not a true idea. It's also bound up with ideas of class, with ideas of gender. This doesn't take place in an intellectual vacuum, as it were. Freud is also formulating those ideas in a specific historical context. Anything else? Any other comment on that, or any other aspects of the uncanny that we wanted to before we end?
What would be a feminist perspective on losing the eye and castration, and the example that you've just given as the female genitalia as home through a masculine lens?
Absolutely. So this actually is one of the most sort of thoroughgoing critiques of psychoanalysis, which is basically that you're right. This is it's from a male perspective. This is very much about anxiety and women here being defined as those who are lacking, those who have already been sort of symbolically frustrated. So yeah, there's absolutely a lot of work here available on sort of the limitations of Freud from a gender perspective. So, for instance, it's a sort of slightly dated work now, but it's one of the sort of the landmarks of how feminism reacts to psychoanalysis. So this is Juliet Mitchell's book, Psychoanalysis and Feminism, which is sort of taking Freud to task for precisely that. The fact that it is the whole of the psychoanalytic model is based on a male perspective, in which are seen as secondary, seen as other. I've spoken a lot as well about metaphors here, and the way in which he also uses geographical metaphors, whether the house, whether that's the spatial metaphor of the conscious above, the unconscious below. In one of his other works, I think this is in the lectures on lay analysis, Freud also talks about, he's giving a history of psychoanalysis, and he admits basically that the psychoanalytic model is based on a male model of sati. And he makes a really interesting comment, actually, in the two lectures on lay analysis, that for psychoanalysis, male sexuality is still something of a dark continent. That's if he uses a dark continent. Not only is this is a mysterious thing, this is something that psychoanalysis can't quite explain, but you've got a language of imperialism there. And you'll have looked at this sort of language as, or maybe you'll have looked at this language of imperialism and colonialism as it works in Victorian slum accounts. This idea of slums of London as being sort of the dark continent within the space of London. So of a colonial metaphor cutting into Freud's wider conception of psychoanalysis, and especially of women as well, which is self-problematic, because then we're back to this idea that Freud does explore in the uncanny of that binarism between savage and civilized. Savages as those who believe in magic, those who believe in omnipotence of thought or of animism, and the civilized as that which has, believes in sort of a more scientific worldview, which unconscious keeps threatening to erupt into the space of the civilized mind. Colonial metaphors that using, there's a sense that civilized are gendered as well. That civilization is the province of men, rationality, and that is the sort of the realm of female sensuality, of female sexuality. It's interesting that actually going back to that point that we raised that I got earlier, that the uterine existence is lascivious, or has lasciviousness about it. The mother is a body rather than a mind. The mother is a sort of this sensualized world than a rational one. So sort of work out there which is devised in theory for leaving out female able to realize female experience, which then where you get actually feminist psychoanalysts like Julia Kosteva, who'll be looking at next week, like Lucy Irigaray, who are trying to reconceptualize myself along lines. They're trying to read this from a very masculinist perspective. But yeah, it's absolutely a sort of a conceptual problem with the kind of arguments that Freud is making. Any other queries or questions or things that we wanted to we have a few minutes left of our. They want to sort of think that I really wanted to sort of look at that in terms of Freud and Uncanny and so yeah. Any other question? Excellent. I would like to suggest then that we sort of explored the various avenues in the Uncanny that we were hoping to have a look at. Just by way of wrapping up, yeah, I've sort of been referred quite frequently to Nicholas Royal's book on the Uncanny. So if you are interested in this a bit further, I do think that's a really good sort of critical place to start. The other piece of reading that I've suggested on Moodle as well is Terry Castle's book, The Female Thermometer. It's not about the Victorian context; it's actually about the 18th century. But Castle's this really interesting argument about the Uncanny and how it relates to the Enlightenment and sort of go for science in the late 18th century, because we tend to think of the late 18th century as being this realm of science, of enlightenment, of a growth of personality. Actually, argument in the Female Thermometer is that the Uncanny arises out of this great enlightenment. So actually, this move towards a greater rationality, irrationality, gives birth to this idea of the Uncanny. That's a very sort of broad strokes summary of Castle's argument, but it is a sort of really interesting of what then leads up to Freud writing in 1919. And likewise, it does also sort of look at this from a feminist perspective as well. So it does talk about these questions of gender in Freud's work. Okay, in that case, then we'll leave it there. If there are any sort of questions or queries, or people wanted me to sort of go over anything, if there's anything that hasn't been quite clear, do drop me an email, and I'll be sort of happy to clarify any points that or any questions that might have arisen. Other than that, we shall leave it there. So, thank you